and I suggest you read it because the 2006 legislation codified the issue of public benefit. Can I just put to you...
So in 2006, Senator?
2006,
yeah, the
sorry,
decision was 1999.
Yes, yes.
Right.
But it did refer...
I mean, you could understand us coming to that view.
I suggest you read the decision before making an assertion on it, because the decision was quite clear. It did make reference to the whole issue of public benefit and weighed up various factors for public benefit, and the 2006 law was a codification of the common law in a sense. I just want to understand where the Australian Christian lobby stands about the need for greater transparency and accountability of religious organisations before they obtain a tax-free status, because obtaining a tax-free status is a privilege, isn't it?
Correct. Yes, it is, Senator. Yep.
And are you concerned that you say that a bad example should make for a bad law, or words to that effect?
Could make, yes.
But are you then saying that you don't think the Church of Scientology should have a tax-free status? Is that what you're saying? Well,
I'm saying that if there's abuses, or if it's not providing a public benefit, then that should be investigated and it should be remedied. And I believe there's recourse to that under existing law. Now, if there's anomalies, that they should be looked at. But we're concerned, as I said, about the process that's led to this current amendment before the Senate.
But isn't it the case, the fact that they still have a tax-free status and there doesn't appear to be a mechanism for people to deal with complaints, does that not indicate to you that the current system isn't working as it should, that there is a lack of transparency and that there's a lack of recourse for those that have complaints about an organisation that has a tax-free status?
I agree that is a problem. If it was a widespread thing right across the sector, I mean, this is a very large sector. There are many churches, religious charities and other charities who have tax concessions, and yet we're not hearing of systemic failure in the system or systemic rorting of the system. So I'm not convinced that it's a widespread problem, that it perhaps needs this approach at this time to remedy it.
So let me get this straight. The Australian Christian lobby doesn't want to have a formal public benefit test in legislation at this stage?
Not at this stage, Senator, not without consultation. And not without a process where the sector could have some input.
Well, we're consulting with you now in a sense. What's your view of having a public... You don't want a public benefit test?
Look, we would need to study the charities commissions and the overseas examples. We'd need to look into it more rigorously than the time that we've had between when this amendment was first floated and between when this committee was set up. So I think it warrants, out of respect for a very important sector of our community which does a lot of good and motivated by very altruistic reasons, that it should have that opportunity. And so I guess what we're trying to do here is put the brakes on the process, not necessarily the motivation behind it, which I think is right. No one is wanting to evade scrutiny or transparency, and that must be always adequate, particularly in public monies at stake. It's the process, Senator.
Okay. Let's leave process to one side and let's look at general principles. Do you agree that if an organisation, if I can put an example to you, a hypothetical example, if an organisation is obtaining tax-free status and there are systemic problems, for instance, on the issue of child abuse, in other words, that whilst the hierarchy of that organisation may not have been aware of it occurring in the first place, they were involved in covering it up. I'm just putting this in broad terms. Is that the sort of thing that you think should be subject to scrutiny in the context of the tax-free status of that organisation?
Well, I would hope that that
again,
the authorities would investigate that well before we got to questions of tax-free status. I mean, you're talking issues of criminality. I mean, that's like the sad example of Elliot Ness that I mentioned before. I mean, that they couldn't get Al Capone for murder.
Elliot Ness,
they got him for tax evasion. I mean, I think that's way down the track in terms.
I'm not talking about tax evasion. I'm talking about tax-free status. That's a complete different.
No, I understand that, Senator, but you're talking about examples of criminality.
Sure, but as a general principle, if there is evidence that an organisation was systematically at the top was covering up issues of abuse, of child abuse, do you think that organisation should deserve to keep its tax-free status?
I wouldn't think so, Senator, but as I say, I think that should have been investigated by the authorities long before we look at the question of
I'm not talking about the authorities. I'm talking about there's the issue of criminality, there's an issue of attempting to pervert the course of justice and all those sorts of issues. That's separate. But in terms of that privilege of having a tax-free status, do you think that...
Look, I think you've got to look at the wider organisation.
I didn't finish my question.
You know,
Sorry.
Look, I'm not sure where you're going with this question.
Mr. Shelton, I didn't finish my question. Sorry.
My apologies.
No, sorry. I'm just saying, don't you think, though, that having a public benefit test, having a charities commission, which is something, we heard evidence from New Zealand and the United Kingdom on that yesterday, wouldn't that be a good thing for those organisations that aren't doing the right thing, that could give other organisations a bad name? Wouldn't that be a safeguard, a check and balance to that sort of behaviour? Won't it cause organisations to do things a little differently, to perhaps manage risks and to manage bad behaviour in a completely different way if they know that their tax-free status would be at risk?
That could well be a benefit of such a charities commission, Senator. But we don't know because we haven't had the chance to look at it in detail. And I don't know that a charities commission is the subject of this particular bill.
No, but it's been raised in the course of evidence,
sure.
And I think...
In terms of the wider public debate, yeah, these are valid issues which could well be important in going forward and ensuring public confidence in the tax-free status of organisations.
Do you think it might also, leaving issues of criminality, that if an organisation, for instance, raises $10 million, but it spends an inordinate amount on administration, on overseas trips for its executives or for its hierarchy, and very little is going down to the grassroots to help the needy, is that the sort of thing that ought to be? Is that the sort of thing that ought to be considered?
Yeah, absolutely, of course. No one will want to see that occurring. I guess the question has got to be asked, are there ways to expose that sort of abuse under the existing system, or do we need extra layers of compliance to ensure public confidence? And I guess that's what the wider consultation would need to show.
And finally, Mr. Shelton, and I appreciate your evidence on this, but do you acknowledge that under the current system we don't have the same level of transparency and accountability that the New Zealand and UK systems have, where there are charity commissions in place?
As I said to Senator Cameron, we haven't investigated that thoroughly. On face value, it would seem that a charities commission would provide that, but I'd want to be sure that even with a charities commission in place, that there wouldn't be scope for abuses.
Well, perhaps, Mr. Shelton, you could take this on notice.
Yeah, we're very happy to.
Yeah, we're reporting on this in the end of August, so I'd be grateful if you could provide, I don't know what Senator Cameron or the Chair's views are on this, but if you could consider this very issue. Do you consider that there will be a greater degree of transparency and accountability by having a public benefit test, and what Senator Cameron has put to you, having a charities commission type approach? That would be, your views would be valued on that.
We'd be very happy to take that on notice, Senator.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Shelton.
I think that's the first step in our process of consultation.
Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, we thank you for appearing this morning.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman.